Hi, I'm Rashonda Kate. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading The House Behind the Cedars by Charles Chesnutt. We're on chapter 5. I think it'll take us 2 times to get through it, but let's see. So chapter 5, the tournament. The annual tournament of the Clarence Social Club was about to begin. The county fairground, where all was in readiness, sparkled with the youth and beauty of the town, standing here and there under the trees in animated groups or moving toward the seats from which the pageant might be witnessed. A quarter of a mile of the racetrack, to right and left of the judges' stand, had been laid off for the lists. Opposite the grandstand, which occupied a considerable part of this distance, a dozen uprights had been erected at measured intervals. Projecting several feet over the track from each of these uprights was an iron crossbar from which an iron hook depended. Between the uprights, stout posts were planted, of such a height that their tops could be easily reached by a swinging sword cut from a mounted rider passing upon the track. The influence of Walter Scott was strong upon the Old South. The South before the war was essentially feudal, and Scott's novels of chivalry appeared forcefully to the feudal heart. During the month preceding the Clarence tournament, the local bookseller had closed out his entire stock of Ivanhoe, consisting of 5 copies, and had taken orders for 7 copies more. The tournament scene in this popular novel furnished the model after which these bloodless imitations of the ancient passages at arms were conducted, and such variations as were required to adapt them to go to a different age and civilization. Well, isn't this fascinating? The Civil War is over. The South has lost. Apparently, before the Civil War, the South was essentially feudal. That's interesting right there. There are the moneyed landowners and the serfs who work for them. I get that totally. And not just slaves, like white people without money were hard off as well. And I mean, anybody who wasn't white was hard off, and then the Black people were slaves. But I guess what I'm getting at, there were landed money owners and then everybody else. I've read Ivanhoe. I really don't remember much about it. What I do remember is, that Chaucer book that I like a lot, that the Canterbury Tales. I do remember that. I like that a lot. But anyway, have you seen, it's about Chaucer. It's called The Knight's Tale. The Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger. Anyway, I'm picturing what's going on here in this novel, like what happened in The Knight's Tale with, a fair and maybe like a Ren Fair. Let's picture a Ren Fair here. Ren Fairs are fun. If you haven't been, you should go. Okay, so we're picturing a Ren Fair here. And what we're saying is the South was essentially like Ren Fairs before the Civil War. And now the people are trying to harken back to the good old days. They are trying to make America great again. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? All right. The best people gradually filled the grandstand. Clearly the best people equals the rich white landholders. The best people gradually filled the grandstand while the poorer white and colored folks, yes, we were correct, while the poorer white and colored folks found seats outside upon what would now be known as the bleachers, or stood alongside the lists. The knights, masquerading in fanciful costumes in which bright-colored garments, gilt paper, and cardboard took the place of knightly harness, were mounted on spirited horses. Most of them were gathered at one end of the lists, while others practiced their steeds upon the unoccupied portion of the racetrack. The judges entered the grandstand, and one of them, after looking at his watch, gave a signal. Immediately, a herald wearing a bright yellow sash blew a loud blast upon a bugle, and big with the importance of his office, galloped wildly down the lists. An attendant on horseback busied himself hanging upon each of the pendant hooks an iron ring of some 2 inches in diameter, while another on foot placed on top of each of the shorter posts a wooden ball some 4 inches through. "It's my first tournament," observed a lady near the front of the grandstand, leaning over and addressing John Warwick, who was seated in the second row in company with a very handsome girl. "It is somewhat different from Ashby de la Zouche." I have no idea what that is. It is the Renaissance of chivalry, Mrs. Newberry, replied the young lawyer, and like any other Renaissance, it must adapt itself to new times and circumstances. Ah, so our Ren Fair conjuration, is that a word? Our Ren Fair idea is accurate. It's what we're supposed to be thinking of. And a Renaissance is a rebirth, a new birth. So let's keep that in mind as well. So hearkening back to old things to have a new birth. Interesting. All right, for instance, when we build a Greek portico, having no Pentelic marble near at hand, we use a pine tree, one of nature's columns, which Grecian art at its best could only copy and idealize. Our knights are not weighted down with heavy armor, but much more appropriately attired for a day like this in costumes that recall the picturesqueness without the discomfort of the old knightly harness. For an iron-headed lance we use as a wooden substitute, with which we transfix rings instead of hearts, while our trusty blades hew their way through wooden blocks instead of through flesh and blood. It is a South Carolina Renaissance which has points of advantage over the tournaments of the olden time. Look at him pontificating. I'm afraid, Mr. Warwick, said the lady, that you're the least bit heretical about our chivalry, or else you're a little too deep for me. The last would be impossible, Mrs. Newberry, and I'm sure our chivalry has proved its valor on many a hard-fought field. The spirit of a thing, after all, is what counts. And what is lacking here? We have the lists, the knights, the prancing steeds, the trial of strength and skill. If our knights do not run the physical risks of Ashby de la Zouche, they have all the mental stimulus. Wounded vanity will take the place of wounded limbs, and there will be broken hopes in lieu of broken heads. How many hearts in yonder group of gallant horsemen beat high with hope? How many possible queens of love and beauty are in this group of fair faces that surround us? The lady was about to reply when the bugle sounded again, and the herald dashed swiftly back upon his prancing steed to the waiting group of riders. The horsemen formed 3 abreast and rode down the lists in orderly array. As they passed the grandstand, each was conscious of the battery of bright eyes turned upon him, and each gave by his bearing some idea of his ability to stand fire from such weapons. One horse pranced proudly, another caracoled with grace. Caracoled. Does it mean kind of circled? I don't know. I assume that's some sort of horse riding term that I am unfamiliar with. One horse pranced proudly, another caracoled with grace. One rider fidgeted nervously, another trembled and looked the other way. Each horseman carried in his hand a long wooden lance, and wore at his side a cavalry saber, of which there were plenty to be had since the war at small expense. Several left the ranks and drew up momentarily beside the grandstand, where they took from fair hands a glove or a flower, which was pinned upon the rider's breast or fastened upon his hat, a ribbon or a veil, which was tied about the lance like a pennon, but far enough from the point not to interfere with the usefulness of the weapon. As the troop passed the lower end of the grandstand, a horse, excited by the crowd, became somewhat unmanageable, and in the effort to curb him, the rider dropped his lance. The prancing animal reared, brought one of his hoofs down upon the fallen lance with considerable force, and sent a broken piece of it flying over the railing opposite the grandstand into the middle of a group of spectators standing there. The flying fragment was dodged by those who saw it coming, but brought up with a resounding thwack against the head of a colored man in the second row, who stood watching the grandstand with an eager and curious gaze. He rubbed his head ruefully and made a good-natured response to the chaffing of his neighbors, who, seeing no great harm done, made witty and original remarks about the advantage of being black upon occasions where one's skull was exposed to danger. Finding that blow had drawn blood, the young man took out a red bandana handkerchief and tied it around his head, meantime letting his eye roam over the faces in the grandstand as though in search of someone that he expected or hoped to find there. Intriguing. So we have a black man. He's got a thick skull. Good thing you're black. You got hit in the head. He's bleeding. He tied a bandana around it, and he's searching for someone that he expected or hoped to find there. Who is this mystery black man? I don't know. Let's pay attention. The knights, having reached the end of the lists, now turned and rode back in open order with such skillful horsemanship as to evoke a storm of applause from the spectators. The ladies in the grandstand waved their handkerchiefs vigorously, and the men clapped their hands. The beautiful girl seated by Warwick's side accidentally let a little square of white lace-trimmed linen slip from her hand. Accidentally? I think not. She's letting her little lacy handkerchief slip down. Maybe there's a gentleman she would like to retrieve it for her. It fluttered lightly over the railing and, buoyed up by the air, settled slowly toward the lists. A young rider in the approaching rear rank saw the handkerchief fall, and darting swiftly forward, caught it on the point of his lance ere it touched the ground. He drew up his horse and made a movement as though to extend the handkerchief toward the lady, who was blushing profusely at the attention she had attracted by her carelessness. The rider hesitated a moment, glanced interrogatively at Warwick, and receiving a smile in return, tied the handkerchief around the middle of his lance and quickly rejoined his comrades at the head of the lists. Ooh, she has now given this mystery rider her token. This is seriously just like A Knight's Tale. If you haven't seen the movie, it's really interesting. And it's got the character Chaucer in it, named from the Canterbury Tales. That was enough for me to like that movie. Okay, I'll keep going. Sorry, I always digress. The young man with the bandage round his head on the benches across the lists had forced his way to the front row and was leaning against the railing. His restless eye was attracted by the falling handkerchief, and his face, hitherto anxious, suddenly lit up with animation. Yes, sir, it's her, he muttered softly. It's Miss Rena, shows you born. She looked like an angel before, but now up there among all them rich, fine folks, she looks like a whole flock of angels. They ain't one of them ladies what could hold a candle to her. I wonder what that man's going to do with her handkerchief. I suppose he's her gentleman now. I wonder if she'd know me or speak to me if she seed me. I reckon she would, spite her getting up so in the world, for she was always good to everybody, and that let even me in. What? Okay. I was really good. I feel like I'm getting better at reading the dialect. Okay, let's try this again. Yes, sir, yes, her. Yes, sir, it's her, he muttered softly. It's Miss Rena, show as you born. She looked like an angel before, but now up there among all them rich fine folks, she looks like a whole flock of angels. There ain't one of them ladies what could hold a candle to her. I wonder what that man's going to do with her handkerchief. I suppose he's her gentleman now. I wonder if she'd know me or speak to me if she seed me. I reckon she would, spite her getting up so in the world, for she was always good to everybody, and that let even me in. Oh, okay, that was the part I was struggling with, and that let even me in. She was always good to everybody, including me. He concluded with a sigh. So Frank is the Black man who got hit on the head, and he has seen Rena give her handkerchief to the young man, and the young man tie the token around his lance, and now Frank is like, I wonder if she would say hey to me if she saw me. I bet she would. I'm skeptical. Let's keep reading. Who is the Lady Tryon? Asked one of the young men, addressing the knight who had taken the handkerchief. A Miss Warwick, replied the knight pleasantly. Miss Rowena Warwick, the lawyer's sister. I didn't know he had a sister, rejoined the first speaker. I envy you your lady. There are 6 Rebeccas and 8 Rowenas of my own acquaintance in the grandstand, but she throws them all into the shade. She hasn't been here long, surely. I haven't seen her before. Okay, so they agree with Frank. She's better looking than all of the other women there. And let's take note of the color pot shot. She throws all of these other white women into the shade. Ooh, okay, one, they're throwing shade, like literally using the word shade to throw shade. Way to go, Chesnutt, for throwing shade before we used the phrase throwing shade. Clearly, we've always had throwing shade. But shade is dark. And so this woman who is legally Black and is darker, supposedly, than her white counterpoints, is throwing shade onto them with her beauty. She has been away at school. She came only last night, returned the knight of the crimson sash briefly. He was already beginning to feel a proprietary interest in the lady whose token he wore, and he did not care to discuss her with a casual acquaintance. He doesn't even know her. And he's like, yeah, she's mine. Shoo shoo. I'm too good to talk to you now. The herald sounded the charge. A rider darted out from the group and galloped over the course. As he passed under each ring, he tried to catch it on the point of his lance, a feat which made the management of the horse with the left hand necessary and required a true eye and a steady arm. The rider captured 3 of the 12 rings, knocked 3 others off the hooks, and left 6 undisturbed. Turning at the end of the lists, he took the lance with the reins in the left hand and drew his sword with the right. He then rode back over the course, cutting at the wooden balls upon the posts. Of those he clove 1 in twain, to use the parlance of chivalry, and knocked 2 others off their supports. His performance was greeted with a liberal measure of applause, for which he bowed in smiling acknowledgement as he took his place among the riders. Again, the herald's call sounded, and the tourney went forward. Rider after rider with varying skill essayed his fortune with lance and sword. Some took a liberal proportion of the rings, others merely knocked them over the boundaries, where they were collected by agile little Negro boys and handed back to the attendants. Oh, let's have these little black boys down here by horse hooves with things falling. It's okay. They've got hard heads. They won't get hurt. A balking horse caused the spectators much amusement and his rider no little chagrin. The lady who had dropped the handkerchief kept her eye upon the knight who had bound it round his lance. "Who is he, John?" she asked the gentleman beside her. "That, my dear Rowena, is my good friend and client, George Tryon of North Carolina. If he had been a stranger, I should have said that he took a liberty. But as things stand, we ought to regard it as a compliment. The incident is quite in accord with the customs of chivalry. If George were but masked and you were veiled, we should have a romantic situation." If George were but masked and you were veiled, we should have a romantic situation. I'm clearly going to come back, but let's see how the sentence finishes. You, the mysterious damsel in distress, he, the unknown champion. The parallel, my dear, might not be so hard to draw, even as things are. But look, it is his turn now. I'll wager that he makes a good run. Okay, so if George were but masked and you were veiled, we should have a romantic situation. Of course we would. Even just the way he's describing it, like, ooh. But let's go back. These guys are in costumes. Okay, the knights masquerading in fanciful costumes in which bright colored garments, gilt paper, and cardboard took the place of knightly harness were mounted on spirited horses. So when I read that, I thought of a masquerade ball where you wear a mask. But here, if we remember the movie A Knight's Tale, and just, you know, horse jousting and those things generally, they wore helmets. Like with their armor, they wore helmets. I know they're not really wearing armor in this, but I feel like they probably had some sort of face covering. I feel like he probably did have on some sort of mask. Okay, and is she veiled? I don't know. Let's see. Okay. The Knights Masquerading. This is all about Ivanhoe. I'm trying to go back to, okay. There's John. I'm afraid Mr. Warwick. Okay, he's having the conversation with his neighbor, which was kind of weird. I feel like we've seen Rena before this, though. Okay, I'll move on in a moment if I don't get to what I want. Okay, the best people were most of them were Masquerades, the Judges, the Bugle. John Warwick has a whole conversation with the lady that was Mrs. Newberry, which was super interesting to me. Riders are going by. Frank, black man, gets hurt. Okay. The ladies in the grandstand waved their handkerchiefs vigorously, and the men clapped their hands. The beautiful girl seated by Warwick's side accidentally let a square of white lace-trimmed linen slip from her hand. It fluttered lightly. Okay, I guess she's not wearing a veil. I felt like there was something, though. I guess I was thinking about the handkerchief as a veil, but Frank saw her from all the way across the lists and he recognized her. So I guess she's not wearing a veil, but I mean, goodness, she really could be. Do you remember in Clotel and in Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom at some point, those ladies wore veils? I've worn a veil. I mean, but at my wedding, but I have a hat. I mean, it's a church lady hat, but I have a hat with a veil, and I will wear that hat with the veil. It's nice. Okay, I guess we'll stop now. I've gone on quite a rant, and Tryon is about to go, and it looks like the rest of the chapter, at least the next few paragraphs or so, are about Tryon's run at heraldry. So this is what I read like. Is this what you read like? Like I read something and I think, this is how we critically engage with our texts. Not just reading the words on the page, but reading for meaning. So thanks for hanging in there with me. I'm Rashonda K. This is Reading with Rashonda.